scary stories and scary videos, be sure to like and subscribe and never miss an episode.
My sister is an RN in one of the local hospitals where I live. I won't say the name of the hospital, but when she first started working there, she had a rather creepy experience while working a night shift on the 4th floor. I'm not sure what she came into contact with that night, but she was scared enough that she needed to tell someone about it. We have always been close, and I was the one she chose to confide in. She told me that she and one of the other nurses were doing their regular rounds that night. They were just walking and looking into open doors of occupied rooms to check on their charges. She told me that it was probably 1:30 in the morning, and things were pretty slow that night. That is when they started to hear screaming from someone on the floor who seemed to be in a great deal of pain. Her first impression was from the sound of the voice it was a young boy, which only concerned her more. She and her colleague ran door to door, looking inside, trying to find the source of the screaming. Most of the rooms at the time were empty, but they checked every one just to make sure. As they cleared each room, their sense of urgency increased. Finally, she said they went down a hallway, and the voice seemed to be getting louder. They continued to check each room for the source of the screams, but continued to come up empty. The further down the hall they got, the more pain the voice seemed to exhibit. They got to the end of the hall and stood in front of a door that the screams seemed to come from. The other RN grabbed the handle and tried to pull the door open, but it wouldn't move no matter how hard she tried. The screams continued to intensify, which added to their need to get in the room. Finally, the door opened, and they rushed into the room. The screams immediately stopped, and despite a detailed search of the room, they couldn't find anyone there. They didn't know what to think. If both of them hadn't heard it, she would have thought she was hearing things. She said they turned to walk out of the room, and the door slammed shut. She said they could feel the temperature in the room drop almost immediately. She also told me that they had felt a presence of evil in the room with them. She couldn't tell me why she thought it was evil, only that she had to get out of the room as soon as she could. They ran to the door and burst through into the hall. She said she heard a maniacal laugh behind her as they ran away from the room, trying to find someone. It wasn't until they went to another floor that they were able to locate some of the other nurses and told them what happened. The others seemed to laugh it off, telling them that they also had some weird experiences on that floor, although none of them could remember someone screaming or a sense of evil in a room. Most seemed to have stories about rattling doors or footsteps in the hall when no one else was there. Needless to say, my sister was pretty disturbed by the experience she had on that floor of the hospital. She refused to ever work on that floor again while working during the night. I can't say that I blame her in the least. She now works on another floor, and as of yet, she hasn't told me about any other experiences in the hospital.
As long as I can remember, I love the Japanese culture, particularly that of the ancient samurai. So it was no surprise to anyone who knew me that as I got older, I began collecting swords and armor from that period. I never really thought about a spirit being attached to one of my prized pieces I have displayed around my home. It wasn't until I purchased a battle-used sword when things began to happen nearly every night. This sword had been used by a warrior who had been killed in combat according to what I was told by its previous owner. One thing you have to understand about these weapons is they, at times, were passed down from father to son for generations. This could have been the reason for the attachment because of a strong connection to the family's past. Although I didn't own the sword very long due to the occurrences that were happening in my home, this is the story of the most active night while it was in my possession. For a little background on what happened before this night occurred, you will need some perspective on what I had been dealing with. It was about a week after I bought it that things started happening, about once every couple weeks. I had placed it on a stand in my living room. One night, while I was watching a movie in my room, I heard something fall somewhere in the house. I was alone that night, so an unusual noise in my home immediately put me on alert. I sneaked out of my room as quietly as I could, trying to find who was in my home. But all I could find was that one end of the new sword had fallen out of the stand. This didn't seem possible since there was at least 1 foot of sword that hung over the edge. So it just sliding off wasn't really likely, especially when the stand was still upright in its normal position and only half the sword was out of place. I chalked it up to freak accident, but wasn't really satisfied with my conclusion. After the sword falling incident, it was about 2 days later that I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps in my home. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the house settling. I do live in an older home, so this type of noise happens fairly regularly. But when I listened closer, the noise was continuous, and at too regular of an interval for it to be anything but footsteps. I have a baseball bat by my bed in case someone decides to enter my home, so I grabbed it and readied myself for a confrontation. I thought that I had heard them coming from the living room, so I snuck out my door. Slowly putting 1 foot in front of the other, I prayed that the floorboards wouldn't squeak, announcing my movement to the intruder. It took me a few minutes of slow movements to reach the living room, but I thought I had been quiet enough to get the drop on whoever was there. The footsteps had continued until I was almost in the room, so I knew someone was there with me. I rushed the last few steps into the living room, the bat held above my head, ready to club the prowler. My eyes had had time to adjust to the dim light so I could see pretty well in the darkness. I swung my head back and forth, trying to locate the threat, but I didn't see anyone. A cold chill ran up my spine. Thinking that they were somewhere else in my home or had somehow gotten behind me, I swung around, checking where I'd come from, but the hall was empty. It took me nearly an hour to search every part of the house before I was satisfied that I was alone. When I got back to my room, I had to sit down on my bed and wonder if I had imagined the noises. The footsteps had sounded so real that I had been sure someone was in my house. The thought that I missed someone didn't seem likely, but the idea of someone sneaking up on me while I slept made for a long, restless night. This went on for almost a month, where once or twice a week, I would wake up thinking I heard footsteps in my living room, but every night I found nobody in the house. I eventually decided to ignore it and turn back over and go to sleep. Seeing as I knew no one was there, I wasn't going to waste an hour trying to find something that wasn't there. I had heard of objects being haunted before. I didn't put much stock into them, considering I'd seen Hollywood portray too many movies about some evil spirit connected to seemingly harmless object. I figured the stories that these shows were based on just elaborate fantasies created by some twisted writer somewhere. Then came the night where I came to understand there are things beyond this world that I wasn't interested in tangling with. The night started out like most evenings. I turned in about 10:45 p.m. after watching a bit of the news and checking the scores that interested me. Around 1:45 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps that had become a regular and at times annoying event in my life. Something, though, about them seemed different, but I couldn't place what at first. I listened closer, and then it hit me. They had always been contained to the living room, but at this time, the steps seemed to be coming right outside my door, as if someone was pacing the hallway. I squinted, trying to get my eyes to peer through the darkness in the hall. My door was slightly ajar, so I had about a foot of space to look through. I waited for them to pass in front of my door to see if I could finally catch what was doing this. It was nearly there, heading back down towards the living room. Then for a brief instant, I saw something dark move past the cracked door. I sat there for a moment, trying to decide what I should do. I know I had seen something out there moving. Of that, I was sure. What I wasn't sure of, though, is whether or not I wanted to know what it was. I was scared of what I would find out there. At this point, I'd accepted that I could either face what was out there or simply let it continue to do as it pleased. As much as leaving it alone sounded like the best option, I was sick of the footsteps waking me up and decided to investigate. At this point, I figured that it didn't matter if I was quiet, so I grabbed my bat and walked out to the living room. I expected to have the same thing happen, like every other time, where I would get myself all worked up, but in the end, find nothing out of the ordinary. I walked into the middle of the room and spun in a slow circle, taking in everything I could. There was nothing. Absolutely nothing there. Exasperated, I decided to try and talk to the empty room. Hell, I'd tried everything else. Is anyone there? Who are you? What do you want? I paused between each question, waiting for a response, even a noise, but all I got in return was silence. I felt stupid. Here I was in the middle of the night, talking to an empty room. I sighed and turned around, ready to go back to sleep. I had already wasted more time than I wanted on this pointless endeavor. As soon as I looked up and down the hall, my eyes fell upon a shape that shouldn't have been there. It looked like a man was standing in front of me, blocking the entrance to the hall. At least, I thought it was a man. He wore traditional samurai armor, including a helmet that covered his face. But everything was black, as if it was made out of the shadows. He stood in front of the stand where my new sword sat, and he reached down to grab the hilt. As soon as the hand attempted to grab hold and lift it up, the shadow disappeared and seemed to be pulled into the sword itself. I was frozen in place, not sure what I had just witnessed in front of me. I wasn't one to believe just anything, but I had seen it with my own eyes. I tried to formulate a rational explanation for what I had just seen, but nothing I could think of made sense. After a minute of just standing there, I seemed to snap out of it and walked back to my room and sat down on my bed, trying to figure out what to do next. I went back through what I could remember about the timeline for the strange happenings in my home. As I put the pieces together, I realized a lot of this started after I purchased the sword and brought it home. Combine that with me seeing the shadow go into the sword itself seemed to point to only one conclusion. Some spirit had to be attached to the sword. That, or I was going crazy. The next day, I did some research on what can cause an object to have a spirit attached to it. It seemed the most common reason was if it was associated with violent deaths. I figured a sword that had been used to kill people more than fit the bill when it came to that. I assumed that the shadow I had seen was either a previous owner of the sword or maybe one of the people that had died by its blade. Either way, I was not interested in dealing with the spirit of a samurai warrior in my house. I sold it the next day at a major loss compared to what I paid for it. Frankly, I didn't care about the money, just getting it away from me. I probably could have had the sword cleansed, but I didn't want to take the chance. I'd seen and heard enough. I still collect swords and other items from history, but I am much more careful with what I bring into my home. If someone had asked me before my experience if I believed in ghosts or spirits of some kind, I probably would have told them, yeah, I guess, or maybe. I wasn't a skeptic, but never having come into contact with anything of the sort forced it into the realm of hypothetical. But sometimes, hypothetical can come up and smack you right upside the head when you least expect it. That is what happened to me on 3 successive nights riding home on a bike I just purchased from a secondhand store. I was coming home late from work one evening. I was a person who liked to get his exercise any way that I could. So given that it wasn't very far, I rode my bike to and from work each day. That night it seemed particularly dark out, so much so that I was having trouble seeing the road, even with the assistance of the light strapped to the handlebars. A new moon did nothing to help the situation.
leaving me with only a small glow on the road ahead. I tend to ride pretty quickly, pushing myself to reach fairly high speeds on my bike. So I was a little surprised when I felt a tug on the back of my shirt. I looked over my shoulder and didn't see anyone there. Not only that, but there also wasn't a light or anything to indicate that any other rider was near me. At the speed I was going, it was also unlikely that someone would be able to grab me either. And most concerning was that if I couldn't see anyone, how could they see me? The start gave me motivation to push a little harder and get home as quickly as I could. I pushed hard down on the pedals to accelerate, and the front wheel of my bike suddenly stopped. Not like braking stopped, but no motion at all. I felt myself pitch forward, and a sudden feeling of weightlessness. Then over the handlebars I went, followed by a brief slide across the ground. I looked up, and I saw a car coming in my direction, and although close to me, I had time to move out of the way despite the aching cuts and bruises that I was sure were forming. Leaning next to my bike, I looked it over, trying to figure out what had caused the wheel to suddenly stop. The bike still looked like it was okay. I seemed to take the worst of the impact, and other than a few scrapes, I felt fine. Grabbing hold of the wheel, I assumed that it would be stuck fast, but it spun freely as if nothing happened just a minute before. I meticulously maintained my bike, seeing how it is my transportation to and from work. Even though I had just bought this bike, used recently, I knew every moving part on it, so I wasn't sure what had happened. I gave everything a once-over and decided nothing was out of place, so I rode the rest of the way home, although in a slight bit of discomfort. The next day, I felt the wreck more than I had when it happened. My elbow was sore where it had hit, and the scabs where the road had cut me pulled against my skin with every pedal. As was my usual routine, I was coming home late down the same road that I had taken my spill the night before, thinking that if someone was messing with me the night before, they would do it again near the same place. Fortunately, nothing happened, and I breathed a sigh of relief when I turned onto the road leading to my house. I thought that I was going to make it home without incident when the front tire of my bike halted again. I must have felt something going wrong, or it could have just been dumb luck, because I didn't get flipped off my bike this time. I looked around the street trying to find my assailant, but the street was empty. I didn't even hear the sound of someone running away in the darkness. I was angry at what were a number of options. First, if someone was doing this to me, I could have been seriously hurt twice now. Secondly, at myself. If I had missed something on the bike that was causing some sort of malfunction, then I was to blame. I committed myself to poring over every inch of the bicycle when I got home. I remounted the bike and began pedaling towards my house. I pulled into my driveway and walked up to the keypad next to the garage door and punched in the combination to open the door. I pulled my bike into the garage and put it up on the stand where I do all my maintenance and repairs. I spent the next 3 hours taking apart everything on that bike, applying grease and lubricant and adjusting every cable and lever on it. Nothing stands out with the wheels or the gears that would cause the failure on the road. I hadn't seen anyone there though, and I didn't find anything wrong with the bike. So I didn't understand what was going on. But a thought in the back of my mind was starting to take shape, something that I didn't want to accept, let alone consider. Riding home the next night, I'm extra cautious. I don't ride nearly as fast, so I don't wreck no matter what happens. My head is on a swivel looking for anyone or anything in the road that would cause my wheel to stop. Things go pretty normally until I get about halfway home. I have to ride down a pretty steep hill and stand up on the pedals to give myself a little natural shock absorption. As soon as my weight was on it, the pedals gave out, my feet dropped to the ground, and the bike is sent off balance, flipping me over a curb. My chest impacts first, and it knocked the wind out of my lungs. My head bounced off the ground, and the world went black. I come to pretty quickly, but I am in an immense amount of pain. I just sit there for probably 15 minutes, just trying to get the road to stop spinning. I knew I have a concussion, and was hoping that the throbbing in my wrist was just a sprain and not a broken bone. The pain is almost unbearable, just dragging myself and what remains of my bike to the side of the road. I'm still trying to shake off my head impacting the pavement. As I try to assess what had just happened, the pedal arm had completely come off and the sprocket had rotated opposite the normal direction. It turned with the axle, which, for those of you who don't know bikes, is almost impossible without a tool to do so. I grabbed hold of it and tried to rotate it back, but it wouldn't move. I looked down to where my pedals used to be, and it looked as if something had melted right through the arm. I looked around trying to find anything in the road that could have caused the wreck, but all I could find were tiny pieces of broken reflectors and 2 pieces of what used to be the pedals. No one was around, no cars, no people. It just didn't seem possible. 3 days in a row, all by myself with nothing mechanically wrong with the bike, and all 3 days the bike malfunctions. And now here it sits, the sprocket rotated the wrong way and the pedals severed. The thought that had started to take hold the night before came front and center in my mind. I had heard of entities attaching themselves to objects before. Was it possible that this was the cause of the problems that I was having? I didn't know for sure, and frankly, I wasn't willing to test the theory. I was done with this bike. Whether it was haunted or just some sort of jinx, I wouldn't ride it again. To this day, I'm unsure of the cause of the 3 accidents on my route back home from work. I threw the bike out, not really caring if it was a waste of money or not. Better out a few bucks than dead, I figured. I went out and bought my next bike new. I figured I would be safe that way. If some sort of entity was attached to a bike, this was the safest bet. So far, everything is going well. I hope it stays that way. My son Chris, growing up, was an only child. So when he was younger, he spent a lot of time alone with his father and me. We brought him a lot of toys, trying to make sure that he would always have something to occupy his mind, so he wouldn't feel lonely. When Chris was younger, he loved to play with balls. He would roll them around the apartment we were living in at the time. When I would clean the house, it wasn't unusual for me to find one randomly under a chair or the couch. Our family loves to go to thrift stores whenever we have a chance. Our son almost immediately runs to the toy section to see what treasure he can find there. In one particular instance, when he was younger, he brought over a strange red leather ball. I'd never really seen anything like it before. The thing that concerned me the most about it was that because of the material it was made of, I wasn't sure how clean it was. But I could see how much it meant to him, and didn't argue when he asked to get it. When we got home, Chris couldn't wait to play with it. He started rolling it around and slamming it against the ground. The ball had what I thought was sand on the inside, so when it hit the floor, a loud thunk would resound through the entire house. I eventually had to ask him not to do it because I was afraid he might hit something and break it. In hindsight, it was probably just as likely to break something with it, just rolling it around. But at the time, stopping the noise was just as much a priority as anything. My son typically will play with a new ball right up to the point that he gets a new one. Then the old one is typically forgotten. Once again, this is also the case with the red leather ball. After finding it abandoned behind a chair for the 3rd straight day, I figured it was time to put it up in the garage for storage. Every other time I did this, he never said anything because he was too involved in the latest and greatest find. For about a week, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then one day, I found the red ball sitting on the middle of our son's room. I figured my husband had gotten it down for him in the garage because he must have wanted to still play with it. I had put it on a shelf that was pretty high up, and I didn't think that my son would be able to reach it without help. When I asked, later on, my husband told me that he didn't get the ball down. That concerned me because I was worried that Chris had climbed up the shelves to retrieve the ball. But when I asked him about it, he told me he hadn't gotten it down. I was a little mad that he would lie to me about something so small, and the fact that I was already concerned about his safety didn't help either. I asked him if he still wanted the ball to play with, or if he wanted me to put it away. He told me he didn't want to play with that particular ball, and it was okay to put it away. So once again, I put it back out in the garage where it had been, with a warning that I didn't want him climbing the shelves anymore. He once again denied doing it, but nothing else made sense at the time. The same thing kept happening where the ball would appear in various places throughout the house. I even went so far as hiding it in our closet only to have it appear in the middle of the living room a day later. That was when I figured I had no other choice but to punish Chris for lying, considering he adamantly denied getting the ball. I mean, if he wanted to play with it, all he had to do was ask, and not play this game where he would take it and then lie about it. A few days later, I was in the kitchen cleaning up the dishes from dinner when I started hearing a loud thunk from the second floor. I knew from experience what that noise was. Chris was slamming the red leather ball onto his bedroom floor. My temper hit the roof, and I yelled for Chris to come downstairs so I could talk to him. To my surprise, he immediately poked his head into the kitchen. There was no way he could have gotten there that quickly, and I would have heard him come down the stairs. I asked him if there was someone in his room, and he told me there wasn't. I went upstairs to check, because I thought Chris had been lying quite a bit recently, so I wanted to see for myself. I went into his room, and there in the middle of the floor sat the red ball. I looked everywhere in his room where someone could hide, but found no one. Plus the ball had been in my closet, where I'd seen it that morning. Immediately, I had a bad feeling about that ball. There was no one else in the house but Chris and me at this time. Yet I had clearly heard the ball bouncing against the floor, and it had somehow gotten into my son's room by itself. I grabbed it and took it outside and threw it away in the garbage can. I didn't want it in my house any longer. I didn't know what to think about it. Was it possible that it could be some sort of spirit attached to it? The next day, I was getting ready for the day and was just finishing getting dressed when I heard what sounded like something falling on top of the bed. I walked out of the closet and stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting on the end of the bed was the ball. I was so scared I didn't know what to do. I'd thrown it away. I took it out of my house to get it away from my family, but here it was sitting there almost like it was mocking me. That was the final straw for me. I took the ball outside and with a pair of pruning shears cut the ball into pieces. I picked them up and threw them away in the garbage can. Fortunately, this time the ball didn't return. I looked in the garbage every day until the trash was taken a couple days later. I am convinced something was attached to that ball. I don't know if it just wanted attention and didn't want to be put away, or if it had some other agenda. One thing I do know is I am happy I found a way to get it out of my home. Sometimes things don't make sense when you are trying to understand them in rational terms. So when you exhaust every possible rational solution to a situation that cannot be explained using what seems possible, then you have to inevitably turn to the improbable. That is what happened to me one morning when I had an experience that had me questioning what was possible. I was getting home late from an evening out with my friends. We were celebrating a birthday and decided that we were going to ditch our significant others and have a girls' night out. It had been a while since we had the opportunity to do this, and we decided to take full advantage. I wasn't someone who liked to drink a lot, but an evening with my friends sounded like a welcome change from my average Saturday night, which usually consisted of takeout and a movie. I got home right around 2:30 a.m. in the morning after being dropped off by a cab. I walked back to my bedroom so I could get out of my clothes and put on something more comfortable, sweatpants and a t-shirt, then headed to bed. I was brushing my teeth and looking at myself in the mirror when I got a bad feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. Something told me that I was being watched. I couldn't see their eyes, but I felt them on me. The hairs on my arms were up, and I had goosebumps running up and down my entire body. I looked around, trying to see if I could find where the source of dread was coming from. I was alone, so I didn't want to go far, but I knew if I didn't see this through then, I wouldn't be able to get any sleep that night. Walking from room to room, I peeked around corners and shone the light from my phone into the shadows. It took me 20 minutes before I'd gotten to search every room and closet in my apartment. I found no one, but the feeling of eyes wouldn't leave me. It had been a while since I had been out in the town, and I thought that maybe it was just me coming down from the music-fueled adrenaline that had been coursing through me the entire night. So I figured that I would finish getting ready for bed and then just read a book for a while to let myself calm down. I finished brushing my teeth and walked over to the bed to lay down. I slid under the covers and reached over for my book. It didn't take long before I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. I set the book aside and switched off the lamp on the table beside my bed. My eyes drifted closed, and I was asleep within minutes. I awoke with a start as I heard a crash against the floor that came from the bathroom. How had someone been able to hide when I looked around the entire place? I thought to myself, unless they had watched me as I went from room to room and moved when I couldn't see them. A cold shiver ran up and down my spine as I pulled the covers a little off of me at a time. I didn't want to make a sound as I approached, hoping to keep the element of surprise on my side. I walked into the bathroom. The room was only partially illuminated from the nightlight that was plugged in by the sink. Shadows surrounded me as I tried to find who was in there with me. I stepped slowly into the room, and a sharp pain shot up my foot. I reached down and picked a small sliver of glass out of my foot. The intruder had broken the vanity mirror on the small makeup desk. There was enough light that I could see the top of it and noticed all the bottles and compacts were still in the places that I leave them. If the mirror would have been bumped by someone, it didn't seem possible that it could have completely missed hitting anything on the desk. It was like someone had picked it up and dropped it on the ground. I walked around the broken mirror, still trying to find out where the intruder was. I got in front of my sink and turned and saw someone. Startled, I yelled out. "Who are?" I yelled. I had seen myself in the mirror and had mistaken it for someone else. I took a steadying breath and pointed at myself in the mirror, trying to downplay how scared I felt. I see a shift in the shadows in the mirror behind me, and my body goes rigid. Every nerve ending feels like it's firing, and I cannot move. I stare into the mirror, waiting for whoever is hiding to show themselves. I want to turn and face them, but instead, all I can do is look at the reflection, unable to face the danger. The shadows seem to dance and flow behind me as a figure seems to emerge. It is like staring into the abyss when I look at it. There is no face where the head is, just a pool of blackness as it floats towards me. There are no arms or legs that I can make out, but just wisps of shadow that seem to form and disappear. It comes right behind me. I'd be shaking if my body could move from absolute terror. I feel pressure on my shoulders like it had placed its hands there, and slowly slid them down my arms in a cold caress. I felt a chill trail down my arm where its touch had been. A gentle breeze passed over my ear, and I knew that its face was right next to my ear. It said only one word, and it sent a chill right through my very soul. My name. It knew who I was, and it scared me more than I thought possible. The breath seemed to abate, and the sensation of its hands left my arms. Unable to stop it, my legs failed me, and I collapsed to the floor. Fear fueled my next move when I lunged for the light switch on the wall. I missed the first time, but on my second attempt, I managed to turn the lights on. My eyes darted back and forth, trying to find out where it had gone, but the room was empty. I was alone. I'm still not sure what was in my bathroom that night, but I believe it came from the mirror on my vanity. I never believed in ghosts or demons until that night. I still live in that apartment, but I got rid of the vanity. I just hope that whatever was there that night has moved on.
For more scary stories and scary videos, be sure to like and subscribe and never miss an episode.